Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Blade Runner 3, Replicant Night, by K.W. Jeter. Chapter 7. Everything that is buried, said Wycliffe, must be watched. Or with his claws, he'll dig it up again. Hands deep in the pockets of the fur-collared coat, Sarah still felt the cathedral's chill sweeping from the ancient walls into her bones. What? Both of the die-hard Tyrell loyalists appeared puzzled. Who's he? Never mind. She shook her head. Nobody. It's just a quote. A scrambled literary illusion. She knew she was dealing with corporate creatures. Neither one of them, had probably ever read anything other than the Tyrell Employees Manual. Just go on. Tell me all about it. From farther away, up by the abandoned altar, at the end of the cathedral's stone nave, came the sound of a chugging power generator. It had been started up with much tugging and fussing at the cobwebbed controls by Wycliffe and Zwingli right after the yacht had settled into the bare fields at the edge of the little town. Or what used to be a town. Sarah corrected herself. The word town implied the presence of people, and there were none here anymore. Just the three of them now, strangers on any land not roofed by money. The bare incandescent bulbs laced along a dangling black cord at the cathedral's peaked ceiling flickered and swayed in the ice crystal wind needling from outside. Small black waves dashed against the shingle of the protected harbor. These are all the monitoring devices. Wycliffe had already pulled back the rotted tarpaulins that had covered the gauges and dials. Spiders and larger creatures scurried away across the circles of broken or dust-clouded glass. He tapped a finger against one device, and a thin black needle jumped and quivered. A row of blue LEDs blinked and ran out a row of numbers. A date 20 years in the past. They're not on the generator. They're kept charged by the field polarity out in the flow. It struck Sarah as odd that a place of such stillness should be called that. The correct name being Scapa Flow, the body of North Sea. The body of North Sea water encircled by the Orkney Islands. North to the Shetlands, south to the Scottish mainland, all depopulated as here. A long way to reach any of the densely imploding, expanding urban centers that had sucked up everything that moved on two legs. Or on wheels. The cobbled streets of Kirkwall, the little town at the flow's edge, were littered with motorized wheelchairs, toppled onto their sides and left to rust. Toggle switches and control sticks mired in the gray, puddling rain. Sad relics, as if the feeblest of time's carriages had ceased functioning, their spoked wheels frozen by the same non-time that brooded beneath the water's surface. The die-hard's ship, at the end of its journey from the Martian emigrant colony, had come in low to the west. From the wall-sized view screen in the lounge, Sarah had been able to see the broken cliffs at the island's rim. the rock columns standing as mute sentinels, abandoned all motion. That was what she would have carved into their sides. All things come to a halt here. Hence, probably the abandoned wheelchairs. Their owners just hadn't needed them any longer. "Do you know how this works?" Wycliffe's voice broke into her dark reverie. "What's going on here?" She said nothing. Better to let him talk, so as to delay the moment she knew was coming. Even in places of stop time, the bad things still approached and then arrived, inevitable. Just my luck, thought Sarah gloomily. Christmas gets cancelled. The oral surgery appointment's still on. This location, not the cathedral, I mean. I'm referring to the Orkneys in general and Scapa Flow in particular, has become a temporal anomaly. Wycliffe slipped into a lecturer's dry, efficient tone. Indications are that it was that way to begin with, even before it started being used as a dump zone for time-depleted stellar drives. That's why, said Zwingli, these islands have such a high concentration of Neolithic monuments, stone circles, megaliths, standing stones, burial mounds, that sort of thing. The eyes behind the square-rimmed glasses grew brighter, as if the topic were some special enthusiasm for him. Artifacts of the dead being more interesting than anything to do with the living. The highest concentration in Europe, and thus in the whole world. Primitive tribespeople must have recognized the area's unique qualities. Whatever. Wycliffe looked annoyed at his partner's speech. He turned an identical owlish gaze back toward Sarah. That's all possible, I suppose, though I personally believe that the flow's suitability for its present use was triggered by the scraping of the Imperial German Navy at the end of the First World War. The word, I think, is scuttling, Zwingli again. The Imperial German fleet was scuttled at Scapa Flow. A pulse of irritation ticked at the corner of Wycliffe's brow. The battleships were deliberately sunk and sent to the bottom, out there. He gestured with one hand, heavily gloved against the cold. At the great wooden doors of St. Magnus, the ravens peering in, black and glitter-eyed, took flight with wings, blotting out whole sections of the cloud-roiled sky. So they form the bottom layer, at least as far as modern history is concerned. There's no telling what might have sunk. There's no telling what might have been sunk and buried for whatever reasons before then. Viking boats, perhaps. His gaze grew distant, as though focused on a scene not visible in present time. Hollowed out logs, woven coracles? Who knows? But if the flow hadn't been a temporal anomaly before then, the insertion of such potentiality-laden material might well have created one, or exacerbated an already existing situation, past a certain critical threshold, so that the first signs of the field's presence were picked up shortly after the turn of the millennium. Then, when the problem arose of the safe disposal of the early depleted stellar drives, this solution was acted upon. Wycliffe peered more closely at her. Is any of this making sense? Sarah nodded. More than. She knew what the two men were talking about. She had been briefed on the history of Scapa Flow and the details of its present use, back when she had assumed control of the Tyrell Corporation. The company, while under the directorship of her late uncle had bought a controlling share in the consortium running the facility, or dump, a more appropriate word, and as had been the usual mode with Eldon Tyrell's business operations, the other partners had been squeezed out one by one, or had wisely abandoned their interests in whatever went out beneath the gray surface of the flow. Why worry about the dead and dead machines at all? Nothing more in their watery cemetery? Better to let the Tyrell Corporation be the keepers of whatever secrets might still be trying to swim up to the light. It's not as if anybody had wanted to do it this way. Wycliffe sounded apologetic. His hand brushed across the dials, clearing some of the dust. There was just nothing else that could be done. It's always better to forget, to destroy the past. Oh, you're right. She regarded the man as though some beam of light had broken through the clouds and the cathedral's roof, revealing some previously unseen aspect of him. Perhaps he was wiser than she had thought. You're absolutely right. A moment of hesitation. Then Wycliffe slowly shook his head. I just meant technologically, that's all. If there had been a better way of dismantling the old first-generation interstellar transports and of getting rid of their depleted drive units. But there wasn't. The consortium, before it settled on abandoning and scuttling the transports here, had even contemplated firing them off planet and into the sun, but there was no guarantee of the results with that method. The sheer amount and nature of the energy lodged in the drives might have triggered some cataclysmic solar reaction. There was just no way of telling. Better to be safe, Zwingli nodded sagely. Bad PR if the sun had gotten blown up. Wycliffe ignored the comment. Sinking the old interstellar transports in Scapa Flow was undoubtedly intended just as a stopgap measure until a means of safely disposing of the depleted drive units had been found. The temporal anomaly that had been found here kept the drive's unwanted effects safely bottled up, at least for the time being. But as we know, what starts out as temporary has a way of becoming permanent, especially after the new drives were invented, the ones in use now, that can operate without the buildup of toxic, aberrational effects. The old drive technology was abandoned. No more of those first-generation interstellar transports were built and put into service, so there was no need to find another way of disposing of them. The dump here at Scapa Flow hadn't reached its limit, so why invest any further research funds into a less than critical situation? That was my uncle's decision. Sarah had read the memoranda in the Tyrell Corporation files, the non-public areas, typical of his thinking. Skin-flint bastard, she mused grimly. Even when the company had been in the trillion-dollar profit levels, even when the company had been in the trillion-dollar profits level, Eldon Tyrell wouldn't have spent a nickel on anything that hadn't brought another dime into his pockets. He didn't care whether it was critical or not, she spoke aloud. That was part of the research he cancelled. The memos had had his initials at the bottom. She had touched the scrawled letters with her fingertips. The crews working out here had still been in the process of determining whether it was safe to leave all those transports underwater, or whether the drive's toxic effects were still building to an explosive level. Wycliffe appeared uneasy, embarrassed. Well, I'm sure Dr. Tyrell was still thinking about this matter before his untimely demise. There were a lot of things he would have taken care of if there had been time. She glared at the man without speaking. There was no more time for Eldon Tyrell. The replicant who'd killed him had drained him of time by cracking his head like an egg and letting the razor-bright sparks of his mind pour out through his red eye sockets. And she was glad of it. Her uncle's unfinished business had probably included her as well. "Plenty of time here," said Sarah. She gestured toward the dials. "By the looks of things." The man beside her nodded. "That's what I meant when I said that everything buried had to be watched. The machines, the monitors, they did the watching. Even if everybody else, everybody human, had forgotten." With her knuckle, Sarah rapped against one of the circular dials until the glass cracked and splintered. She picked out the triangular shards, then used one fingernail to scratch at the black pointer beneath. It was painted on, fixed at one number along the dial's rim. "These are fake." She looked at Wycliffe beside her as she rubbed the black paint flecks from under her nail. She gestured toward the other dials and gauges, the banks of monitoring equipment, the lights and numbers glowing in the cathedral's dim space. "They all are, aren't they?" "Well, possibly." Bony shoulders hunched beneath Wycliffe's jacket. He held out his large knuckled hands and tilted them from side to side. "When this installation was set up to watch over the scuttle transports, there was some, stage setting done to make it look impressive to the other consortium members. Dr. Tyrell didn't want them jumping ship, so to speak. So really, there's been no monitoring here at all. That's the deal, isn't it?" Sarah let her gaze narrow upon the man. "The interstellar transports that were dumped here. Anything could have been going on with them, with the depleted drive units and their toxic effects. They might in fact have reached some kind of critical mass. The temporal abrasions in the field might not just be toxic. They could very well be lethal." She let one corner of her mouth lift in a parody of a smile. "If you want me to go down there, that might be the same as killing me. You might as well shoot me now and get it over with. You must admit that seems a little inconsistent with people making claims about how they have my best interests at heart, or even just the interests of the Tyrell Corporation." Wycliffe said nothing, turning his face away from her as though in shame. "I'm right," thought Sarah. Not that it was any comfort to her. The truth never was. "Miss Tyrell, please." The softer voice of Zwingli came from a few paces away. "Please don't be mad at us. There really is nothing else we can do. It has to be this way." "I've heard that one before." Inside my own head, she thought grimly, as well as from these two, when they'd been putting the pressure on her back at the hovel on Mars. Sarah supposed they were as locked into their fates as she was. "It's all right," she said finally. "I don't mind. It's pretty much what comes with the territory, isn't it? When you're Tyrell blood." Neither man said anything. Outside, the ice-flecked wind picked at the cathedral's raftered bones. Sarah could hear, past the low electric hum of the fake monitoring equipment, the gray waves lapping at the village's shore. In a storm, she supposed, the seawater might roll against the abandoned doors, pour through the empty houses. Somehow, without even noticing, she had walked out of St. Magnus's Cathedral all the way to the edge of the flow. She found herself Once her bleak thoughts and memories had faded, gazing out at the water, its surface a darker shade of the steel-textured clouds above. She sensed another's presence. Wycliffe standing behind her. "So exactly what is the way I'm supposed to get down there?" Sarah didn't glance over her shoulder at the man. She gave a single nod toward the water. "Down to the Salander 3, I mean? Jump in, hold my breath, and swim?" A slight motion in the chill air. She knew that was Wycliffe stiffening, his spine pulled tight by the mention of the ancient interstellar transport's name. A name that he and the other men had yet to speak aloud, that was even more weighted with dire meaning than the words Scapa Flow. At the corner of her eye, she saw his gloved hand extend and point. "There's no need for that, Miss Tyrell." Wycliffe's index finger aimed toward a small triangular structure floating in the distance, so small that Sarah hadn't spotted it before. "There's a pressurized shaft extending down to your destination. The Shadow Corporation. Well, Zwingli and myself, actually, had it installed before we went out and contacted you and brought you here." "I see." Sarah glanced back at him. "That was thoughtful of you." "Of course." A thin smile moved across Wycliffe's thin-lipped visage. "We really are thinking only of your comfort." "Sure you are." She shook her head, feeling how cold and hard her face had become, as though the ice in the wind had penetrated her flesh and seeped into the veins beneath. "If that were the case, you wouldn't even want me to go down there." She took a sadistic pleasure in speaking the transport's name again. "To the Salander 3. Zwingli had come out from the old cathedral and joined them by the shore of the flow. Sarah could sense his presence, and the silent exchange between the two men, the glance passed between them. "Miss Tyrell, we've gone over this before. It's the only way." One of them spoke. She wasn't sure which. The voice fluttered and was taken away by the wind. Probably Wycliffe, the default spokesman for the pair. "If the Tyrell Corporation is to be restored, if it is to come out of the shadows and be what it was before, and even more than that, then this must be done. By you. No one else can do it. It is, after all, your past that we're talking about here, that must be confronted and brought into the light." Her past, all of it, she told herself, right back to the beginning. She had been born aboard the Salander 3, far from here, far from Earth itself. That past, her past, was a world unto itself, sleeping beneath Scapa Flow's waters. "I know." The wind had invisibly peeled away her skin, exposing the flesh and scraped bones beneath. That was what it felt like. Sarah had to take her hand out of the coat's pocket and hold it out in front of herself, like some white, fragile artifact, to dispel the illusion. If that's what it was. There were ghosts down there in the old interstellar transport. That was the essential toxic effect of the first-generation drive units, the technology, the relatively crude way of getting from one point to another, from Earth to the stars, had worked by generating perturbations in the time field surrounding the transports, enabling them to achieve faster-than-light velocities as though being sucked from one zone of artificially high temporal potential to a lower one. Falling through time, infinite distances converted thereto, the churning machines holding on to each moment of the present, elongating them like some vacillating Faustian bargain. The drawback being, as she knew from the old memos she had seen in the Tyrell Corporation files, that the first generation interstellar drive units became depleted, lost their propulsive function, as the layers of undissipated temporal energy accumulated. Screwing around with time itself had its price. Within the transport's little encased worlds, past and present became confused, impossible to sort out. Then there would be no forgetting. That saving mental grace, the only thing that made sanity possible, would be gone. Toxicity, madness, death. Better to sink the contaminated machinery into a dark, wet hole, the only place whose own temporal anomalies had a chance of matching these newly created ones. But I got out. Sarah spoke her thoughts aloud. She looked back over her shoulder at the two men. Before it, the past, before it could contaminate me, before it could kill me. I was only 3 years old when the Salander 3 returned to Earth. That child, that long vanished incarnation of herself, had been the only living thing aboard the transport when the autonomic piloting systems had brought it back to this world. When the Salander 3's doors had been unsealed and the Tyrell Corporation's employees had gone in, they had found only the little girl named Sarah and the corpses of her parents. Family history, deep and dark as the currents of the ocean surrounding Scapa Flow. Little things that hadn't been in the old memoranda, the company's official archives, but that she had found out anyway as she had been growing up. The way children always find out things by overhearing whispers, and even more tellingly, by hearing the silences that the adults clicked into when they knew she was in the room. That was how she had found out what had happened to them. The faces she knew, recognized from the digitized press clippings in the company files. Anson and Ruth Tyrell. There had been a photo of the two of them, with an oddly human, sentimentalizing touch. A long-haired, marmalade cat in the woman's arms. A pet that was going to accompany them on their exploratory voyage to the Proxima system. The two people in the photo had been smiling, full of an eager confidence. Sarah had calculated that her mother had become pregnant either shortly before the photograph had been taken or just after, when the interstellar transport had left Earth orbit. Her parents had been unaware of their fate, the fate of the Salander 3. The transport had turned back 1/6 of the way to Proxima. The clever relays and circuits wired into its computers doing the best they could, ferrying back the dead and the living. 2 adult corpses and an infant tended by machines, nursed on synthesized breast milk. Her second birth had come 3 years later, when the Tyrell Corporation employees had unsealed the transport's main hatch and one of them had led her out by the hand. There was no way Sarah could remember that, just more of what she had been told and had overheard, and had dug out of the company archives. And what happened to the cat, she wondered, not for the first time. The poor thing. Sarah gazed out at the uncommunicative water, feeling the chill sweep closer to her core. She supposed that was another mystery. the answer to which was down there with all the others in the hulk of the Salander 3 itself. "That's why you want me to go down there, isn't it?" She managed to bestow a bare fragment of a smile upon the two men. "To find out what happened to that silly cat." They showed no sign of puzzlement at her words. "You have to go down there," said Wycliffe, to restore the Tyrell Corporation." "Something went wrong," Zwingli gazed out across the flow. "A long time ago." "At the beginning," Wycliffe nodded slowly. "It had to have been then, when Dr. Tyrell and his brother created the corporation. Somehow, everything that happened since then, including the destruction of the Tyrell Corporation, the seeds were planted right back at the start of it all." She envied the dead. This also not for the first time. "They've got it easy," thought Sarah. The two Tyrell brothers and the wife of one of them. All the bad things that fate had in store, they had already gotten through, and gone on to whatever place there was that had no time, neither past nor dreaded future. She knew she wasn't that lucky, or at least not yet. The past was waiting for her, just a few minutes ahead, when she would go down into the remains of the Salander 3, her first home, which, in some way, she had never left. "We can't go back to the very beginning. That's too far," Wycliffe's voice continued at the edge of her thoughts. "There's nothing left. It's lost. But this much we can do. We can go this far, to whatever happened then, in there." He nodded toward the gray water and the vessels hidden beneath the surface. "But you're the only one who can go there and find out. The secrets, the mysteries, all that we need to know." This is what I get. She supposed it served her right. She had envied the dead and had tried to become one of them. Deckard had loved, and still loved, the replicant with Sarah's face. Rachel had already become one of the dead. The terminations of her 4-year lifespan postponed just a little bit. Not that it mattered, finally. For either herself or Rachel, the dead were the only ones who escaped. For the living, there was only the past and the future. The same thing in either direction, and equally painful. It was stupid of me to even try. Standing behind her, Wycliffe was still wrapped up in his explanations, the rationale behind their journey to this bleak spot. "We don't even know why," his voice spoke in a child's baffled tone. "The Tyrell Corporation sunk an awful lot of its operating capital into the Salander 3 expedition. And we don't even know what they were looking for out in the Proxima system. What they were trying to achieve. What they thought Anson Tyrell was going to find out there. Not in the files, was it?" Sarah knew. She'd looked herself. That information was deleted, erased, extinguished. And you know, don't you, who must have done that? Both men nodded. "Dr. Tyrell," Wycliffe morosely said. "Eldon Tyrell, your uncle." "Eldon Tyrell did a lot of things that you don't know about." She heard her own voice darken in tone. "Some of them you don't want to know about." Sarah looked over her shoulder and saw the two die-hard loyalists appearing uncomfortable, exchanging glances from behind their square-framed lenses at each other. "Those kinds of things," Zwingli spoke up, "that might be personal information, family secrets, that we don't need to know about, to bring the Tyrell Corporation back into existence." "That's where you're wrong," said Sarah. "There's no such thing as personal with the Tyrell Corporation. There never was. Or to put it another way, everything is personal. When my uncle was alive, the company was just the contents of his head, made big. And then it was yours," a softly uttered reminder from Wycliffe. "Your company, and your personal matters." Head turned, Sarah regarded the man, seeking any clue as to just exactly and how much he and his partner were aware of. "Maybe I was wrong," she mused. "Maybe they weren't quite as stupid as they looked." She'd had to be careful. Her own reminder this time. "But all that came later," Wycliffe spoke, letting his steady gaze meet hers. "We need to find out what happened a long time ago on the Salander 3. "That was really the turning point," added Zwingli. "If you study the history of the Tyrell Corporation, what can be pieced together from the files and the other records, after the failure of the Salander 3 mission and the deaths of Anson and Ruth Tyrell, your parents' deaths, then things were never the same. That was when the company's Los Angeles headquarters became such a fortress that your uncle retreated into, and the Tyrell Corporation grew both in power and secrecy." "You're telling me things I already know." Sarah turned from the flow's shore to face the two men. "I've gone over the files as well." "Ah, but it's not just what's in the files, or what Dr. Tyrell left there." Wycliffe looked smug, pleased with the workings of his brain. "Some of the connections you need to make. Those happened outside the company, in the rest of the world. The Salander 3 expedition that you were born during, that was the last exploratory voyage. That was the last exploratory voyage outside the solar system. After the Salander 3 came back without even having reached its destination, the UN launched its off-world colonization program. Within a couple of years, the UN was sending the first groups of human settlers out to the stars, and the Tyrell Corporation had the exclusive franchise on supplying replicants to the colonization program. That's when the money started to happen in a big way." The man's eyes glittered behind the square glasses. "It's what enabled Dr. Tyrell to establish a monopoly on all aspects of replicant technology. With the money he was getting from the UN, he was able to either buy up any patents that he didn't already own or drive the other companies out of business. For all intents and purposes, from that point on, Tyrell was the replicant business. The company had no competition, and the UN went along with whatever prices Dr. Tyrell decided to set. The Tyrell Corporation was the sole supplier for the one essential element to the colonization program." "Bad move on the UN's part," Sarah gave a shrug. "Just goes to show that those people don't know how businesses are run. You never let somebody get a hand on your throat that way." "Perhaps," the smug look didn't vanish from Wycliffe's face, "unless the UN didn't mind paying that price. They didn't mind giving the Tyrell Corporation such an expensive monopoly. That might all have been part of the deal that had been set up between the UN and Dr. Tyrell. The company gets the franchise on supplying replicants to the colonists, and the UN gets the colonization program. But Dr. Tyrell gave the UN as his part of the bargain, made the program possible, so the UN could go ahead with it. The smugness shifted into a self-satisfied smile. And that's where the Salander 3 comes in. Really? Sarah raised an eyebrow. That's your theory. The Salander 3 expedition. My father and my mother found something out that the Tyrell Corporation sold to the UN. Some information, perhaps, about what was out there in the stars, and that was worth enough to the UN for them to hand over the replicant monopoly. Interesting conjecture. Perhaps it wasn't information, Miss Tyrell. Perhaps it was something even more valuable to the UN and its program. Perhaps it was the suppression of information. Silence, marred only by the passage of wind over Scapa Flow's waters, as she considered the other's words. But that would mean... Exactly, said Wycliffe, as though he had discerned the currents of her thinking. It would mean that Dr. Tyrell did whatever was necessary to suppress the information that the Salander 3 expedition had discovered, that the expedition had been aborted and brought back to Earth on his orders, and that those who possessed the information, your parents, were, shall we say, suppressed as well. Murdered. A homicidal spark flared in Sarah's heart at hearing more of the man's dancing, evasive words. That's what you mean. Of course it is. Both of the men gazed owlishly back at her. You'll have to excuse our efforts at being diplomatic, but this is, Wycliffe spread his hands apart, a delicate subject, a not very pleasant possibility. You should have thought of it yourself, muttered Zwingli. The fact you didn't, that says a lot. Precisely. Lanky, black-sleeved arms folded themselves across Wycliffe's chest. This smacks of avoidance on your part, which seems odd given your rather obvious antipathy toward your uncle. You know, you might be right, Sarah slowly nodded. It just goes to show, she thought, you can never hate some people enough. There was always more. She looked away from the two die-hard loyalists and back toward the dark waters mirroring the steel-clouded sky. The answers were there, beneath the small waves that lapped across the stones toward her feet. Her uncle hadn't been able to suppress everything. The past remained, captured and bottled and buried away from the light, waiting for her. All right, Sarah said aloud. I'll go down there and see what I find. Thank you, Miss Tyrell. The voice came from behind her, and didn't know. The voice came from behind her. She didn't know which of them it was. That's all we're asking of you. As if that weren't enough, she tugged the fur-collared coat closer around herself, futilely trying to ward off the cold winds.